Week 2 in the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee saw all shades of the good, the bad, and the ugly of budgeting in Boise. There was a mixed bag of victories coming out of JFAC this week, with some notable wins for fiscal conservatives and for government accountability. However, there were also some very large budget asks that made their way out of committee despite opposition from conservatives. Starting with the good news from JFAC, it appears that conservatives have won on issues concerning the proper role of government, the free market, and accountability for how tax dollars are spent. The first victory comes as the budget for the Child Welfare Division of the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare was up for consideration without a key supplemental included, a $2 million supplemental for family support funds. These funds sound innocuous, but they extend beyond the proper role of government and work as a program that teaches parents how to parent. Not only is this an overreach of the state, but recommendations on adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, training provided by the CDC call for the inclusion of social emotional learning, a vehicle for critical race theory. Another huge savings on the part of the taxpayer is the elimination of a $43 million supplemental and a corresponding $36 million line item in the Department of Health and Welfare's budget to provide free daycare services. This would have a new entitlement program that was funded by federal dollars with purse strings attached. Idaho Department of Health and Welfare Director Dave Jepson noted in his presentation before JFAC earlier this year that these are necessary because parents are, quote, losing money by putting their children in childcare so that they could go to work. But this doesn't make sense. Why is it the role of the taxpayer to subsidize such poor financial decision-making? Additionally, wouldn't we want parents to be home and engaged in raising their own children rather than breaking up families and sending them away to be raised by others? Stopping this grant prevented government overreach and the expansion of welfare programs that ultimately harm families. One final victory to mention is that JFAC voted to audit the use of community partner grants in the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare by a party-line vote. Last month, the IFF broke a story that Senator Zeiderveld revealed that the department was illegally disseminating these grants to woke groups like the Idaho Association for the Education of Young Children and other groups that focus on services for pre-K students, despite this not being allowable in the bill that appropriated the funds. It is a good sign that the legislature is taking this issue seriously, as taxpayers expect that their funds will be used appropriately. On a less lustrous note, some big spending items still made their way out of committee despite the efforts of conservatives. In a prior episode of Fiscal Fridays, we described how the Office of the Secretary of State requested large line items for new elections data systems and additional full-time staff. Conservatives like Representatives Tina Lambert and Josh Tanner proposed an alternative motion designed to cut unnecessary staff. This motion even garnered support from both chairs like Senators C. Scott Grow and Representative Wendy Horman. However, committee voted for the original motion that would move the elections data system from a supplemental to a line item and only cut an extremely part-time receptionist. In the vein of big spending, the committee voted to approve the Department of Parks and Recreation's budget with nearly $11.5 million in line items. It is interesting to note that JFAC did not consider the $100 million supplemental for parks maintenance, but it is likely that this action will come up as JFAC nears the end of the budget-setting process. Some of the worst spending projects we have seen this week came in the form of a supplemental from the Department of Commerce. This supplemental is $124 million in funds from the Biden administration's American Rescue Plan Act. In the original appropriation for the 2023 fiscal year, the legislature provided $10.9 million from the ARPA Capital Projects Fund and $100 million from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the IIJA, for broadband development. This measure adds another $124 million on top of that in funding from ARPA. This more than doubles the 2023 appropriations for these projects. ARPA and the IIJA were contentious measures from Washington, D.C. because they represented gross federal overreach and a surge in the national deficit. These concerns were compounded by issues of the state sovereignty, and since the federal government would effectively own the newest broadband developments in Idaho, paid for on the backs of our grandchildren. This supplemental represents the staggering growth of Idaho's dependence on the federal government. This supplemental has now been introduced before the Senate and will likely be considered in the next few days before the body. As we wrap up, we have an even crazier week ahead for us in the final week of budget setting. The committee is expected to consider some of the most controversial line items and supplementals during that time, with issues ranging from Medicaid to public schools. Though conservatives had some notable wins this week, they will need to be ready for some of the biggest budget fights of the year. It will take a great deal of work to ensure that we don't have more spending on welfare programs and other big items similar to broadband bill described above. Lawmakers must keep in mind whose money they are spending as they tackle these important issues next week. For more episodes of Fiscal Fridays, articles, and bill ratings, please visit idahofreedom.org.